Thank you very much, Oni, Décio, and Jonas for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to talk to this audience. As the title of my talk may suggest, this is more kind of a historical presentation than a physical or philosophical presentation. So it's kind of a mix in this workshop dedicated to quantum mechanics and quantum information. This presentation, let me see here, just a minute, okay. This presentation is part of a book I am editing, which should appear this year. It's an Oxford Handbook of the History of Interpretation of Quantum Physics. Among the editorial team, we have Olival Freire Jr, who is here, and a few chapters include a chapter by Décio and colleagues, and also a chapter by Jean-Philippe Martinez, who is here, I have seen here. Now, the subject of my talk has certain relation with the very fact that this series, Oxford Handbooks, which is a traditional series in the scholarships everywhere, they accepted to have a handbook dedicated to history of interpretation of quantum physics. And we understand history of interpretation as a short expression, short term for history of interpretations and the foundations of quantum physics. This handbook, as the workshop we are developing through this week, which is the 7th workshop dedicated to such subject, this just means the obvious things that there is research, thus there is debate on the interpretations and foundations of quantum mechanics. I would say that, to be more precise, we have indeed a scientific and a philosophical controversy over the foundations and interpretation of quantum mechanics. And I would say that this is a well-acknowledged fact by scientists and philosophers who are engaged in such activities. I am saying things that are very obvious, but you may understand that everybody who is in this room, they, by definition, they understand that it's important to have debates in the research about the foundations, interpretations of quantum mechanics. Still, among historians of physics, we also have a number of historians who have dedicated works about the history of this development. Just to cite a few names, this book, which is a reference for everybody, The Philosophy of Quantum Mechanics by Max Yammer, but we have works by Paul Forman about the context in which the causality was accepted as a feature of quantum mechanics, and we have papers by Kaiser, by myself, by Bromberg, by Oswald Pessoa, who is here, by Stefan Osnag. We have a collaboration in this sense. Then my question in this talk is how we may understand this controversy through the lens of 20th century physicists and philosophers of science. Then I don't want to see now to make a discussion about the historiographical issues and the history issues. I just want to use history approach to see how physicists and philosophers of science at large saw this controversy to the 20th century, a controversy which is approaching its centenary, because in 2025 we have 100 years since the controversy over the interpretation of quantum mechanics began in 1925. Now, if this is my question, I will approach this question through three topics. I will speak first about the physicists' attitudes towards the quantum controversy. Second, philosophers' views on the quantum controversy. And third, I will discuss a little bit the role of experiments in this controversy. The first question, how physicists saw the existence of this controversy? Broadly speaking, I can talk about three different stages in the history of the debates about the interpretation of quantum mechanics. The first stage is kind of the stage where the great physicists, the founding fathers of the discipline, just clashed over the interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's the time. It was the time where Bohr, Schrödinger, Paul, Max Born, Niels Bohr, Einstein, De Broglie, and the others debated about discussed about the interpretation of quantum mechanics. I would say that the most iconic picture we may have about this debate is the debate between Bohr and Einstein. You may find a number of pictures of these two giants of physics, always discussing the meaning of quantum mechanics. This first stage, I don't want to be precise in the chronology here, but the first stage is something which began in 1925, and it continued with some interruptions until the late 1940s. Now, in the first stage, we can say that there was a controversy. This was well acknowledged by all physicists, but it was a controversy where young physicists did play a minor role in these debates. We have a few ones. Even if you take, for instance, Leon Rosenfeld, he was beginning his activities at that time. Landau was a young physicist when he clashed with Bohr about the measurability of quantum field, electrodynamic quantum field. In a number of other years, but the main mark was the role played by the founding fathers. We have at this time we have a very important woman, a philosopher, a German philosopher, who criticized, for instance, von Neumann's proof against the possibility of the existence of hidden variables in quantum mechanics. But this was not the general rule. The general rule, which was very clear, it was a debate for the most influential physicists of the time. Then we had a second stage, which began around 1950, 51, 52, and it lasted, I would say, till the mid-1980s. It was the time of the appearance of the protagonists I called then quantum dissidents. Sorry, the English and Portuguese is mixing, quantum dissidents. It was the time that David Bohm presented his alternative interpretation, 1952. It was also the time Hugh Everett presented his work in 1956, 57. We had also minor fields like Klaus Tausk, a Brazilian physicist who engaged in 1967 in this kind of debates, and the other, we also had, please, sorry. It's everything okay now?
No, everything is fine, Olival. Go on.
Okay, okay, thank you. And we had physicists, experimental physicists like Clauser. But what I want to emphasize in this second stage is that in spite of the important role played by these physicists, and among them, the most influential, who was John Bell, in general, physicists at the time, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they did not recognize the importance of the debates about quantum physics. The prevailing attitude among the physicists at the time, it was the idea that foundational issues were already solved by the founding fathers. This was solved by Bohr. There was no physics to be done in this field. The best description of this scenario would say that these physicists were doing philosophy, not physics, philosophy of physics, philosophy of science, but not physics. And in the worst scenario, some of these physicists were considered just cranks, or just what they were doing was not real physics. I would have a number of cases to tell you here, but I don't want to spend time on this, because this is one thing that I have written about this. My book, The Quantum Dissidents, is entirely dedicated to this people. The main feature of this period I want to emphasize is that the quantum controversy was not recognized as a genuine controversy at the time. And as a consequence of this attitude, some of the physicists who were engaged in these debates, they suffered what John Bell called the stigma against the foundations of quantum mechanics. And these four physicists, that's the reason I singled out these four physicists, all of them had their careers hampered by the physicists' reaction to their works. Clauser, for instance, who is a great experimental physicist. Clauser is the guy who made the first experiment concerning Bell theories. It's the result published by Friedman and Clauser in 1972. Clauser never got a position in the American universities. And we have documents showing that some of the colleagues of Clauser, some important colleagues like Richard Feynman and the others, just saw what Clauser was doing like bad science, or even they doubt if it was real science. And then we had a third stage, which was a slow transition. I don't want to go in the details about this transition. Some of this transition began in the late 70s, but I would say that a landmark in this transition was Alain Aspect experiments in 1981 and 1982, in the sense that Alain Aspect was immediately recognized by the relevance of the three experiments he published at that year. He was immediately invited for a number of scientific conferences, and I cited Richard Feynman. Alain Aspect himself had an experience of visiting California in 1984, and he was well accepted by Feynman, who liked very much Alain Aspect experiments. But the transition was smooth, and in the early 90s, there was a huge transition. It's the time when there was what I call the surge of quantum information. The number of papers, so the perspective of a new disciplinary field with possible technological implications, this blossomed in the mid-1995, in the mid-1990s. More precisely, 1995, it's the year which was the watershed in this transition. From then on, I would say that quantum controllers is considered part of regular physics. I would say that it's not highly considered in the field of quantum information, but it's considered. It's a kind, I would say, the poor cause of the quantum information community, but it's considered. And we have a number of mainstream physicists who are working in quantum information, who are very attentive to the debates about foundations. If I may cite just one of these, you would say that it's the name of Anton Zeilinger. If I needed to, I could cite others, but I think that Anton Zeilinger, it's enough to represent this field. It's not by chance that the Institute of Physics in Vienna nowadays is also a hub not only for theoretical and experimental research in quantum information, but also research in foundations of quantum mechanics. So, my conclusion is that the physicists at large, they did not play a very good role in this history, because if you have 100 years of controversy, at least 30 years were marked by the underestimation of the relevance of this subject among physicists. But not only underestimation. For the physicists who had their careers hampered by the prevailing attitudes at that time, this was kind of a very important loss for physics. Just take the case of Everett, this brilliant physicist who suggested in 1956 the relative states interpretation. As you know, Everett tried to discuss with Niels Bohr his interpretation. He was supported by John Wheeler to do this, and he was rebunked by people in Copenhagen. And Everett, who was very talented as a mathematician, he just moved to do research mathematics for the American defense, and he never come back to physics. Klaus Taussig, this Brazilian physicist, he published in 1967 an important, he published a preprint criticizing what was known at the time as the thermodynamic amplification problem, by the Italian physicist Daniel and Prosper, and in a paper written by Oswaldo Pessoa, myself, and Alex de Grey, we shown how Taussig was isolated, interested in Italy, where he was at the time, and in Brazil at the University of São Paulo. And Taussig's scientific career was literally blocked. So I would say that physicists in general, they are not in a good position to speak about these 100 years of scientific controversy. I am emphasizing what happened in the second stage, but it's clear that if you invite physicists now to speak about quantum entanglement, etc., he would say that Bohr said this, Einstein said this, but he would not speak about what happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's not a nice story. Now, let's talk about the philosophers. I think that the philosophers were not so different than the case of physicists. Sorry. I'd say that if I take two cases that in the philosophy of science, the 20th century philosophy of science, they are in opposite stances, Popper and Feyerabend, in which concerns the debates about the foundations of quantum mechanics, we can say that Popper and Feyerabend were major protagonists in the quantum debates. Popper was very influential in this kind of research, because he dedicated a lot of energy to this subject. and as you know, the third volume of the philosophical postscript was dedicated to the schism of physics. Popper arrived to suggest an experiment which was held not when he was alive, it was held after his death, but it was a very important experiment. Still today, you can find in the literature discussion about what conclusions we may arrive about the Popper's experiment. But Popper and Farabi, it's a history, and Thomas Kuhn, the very influential philosopher, the largely influential philosopher during the 20th century, his story is another story. In a nutshell, I would say that for Kuhn, as after 1927, we begin a normal science period, ending the period of revolution, which was from till 1927 to 27, then I would say that for Kuhn, no longer controversies were desirable. This position of Kuhn, you may have an idea of this position of Kuhn, either reading Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, or making an inspection about what Kuhn was silent. Kuhn dedicated major work in the history of science on the Planck's work and the reception of Planck's work, but Kuhn never dedicated one or two paragraphs about the debates on the interpretation of quantum mechanics after 1927. A few philosophers criticized Kuhn. I would say I will show the case of Jeffrey Bubb, but the most influential criticism was done by Marabelle. I would not speak about Beller's criticism because it is well known by everybody in the audience. If you take the Quantum Dialogue, the book by Marabelle sustained that the idea of paradigm by Kuhn was a kind of a transposition or a translation of what she called the dogma from the Copenhagen interpretation. But I would cite just a reference, an episode where Jeffrey Bubb, this philosopher well known by you, he faced this kind of contraposition with Kuhn. It was in the end of the 60s. Then Bubb and Kuhn were in a conference in the United States. Bubb was representing David Bohm. You remember that Bubb was a student of David Bohm. And after the talks, there were discussions, and the discussions are recorded in the volume from these proceedings. It's a volume organized and edited by Patrick Supp. Frederick Supp. Then, in these debates, at a certain moment, when the question of the validity of the paradigm, normal science, etc., was under discussion, Kuhn said this: "It's my impression that one of the greatest difficulties faced by people who are concerned to revise the Bohr interpretation is that none of the problems that emerge from them makes any contact whatsoever with the technical problems that physics has faced in recent years, and that has created a profound crisis for the profession." So you see, Kuhn was saying, not only saying that the Bohm, etc., were not doing good physics, but they were responsible for a profound crisis for the profession. Then Bubb replied with these words: "Something about what Professor Kuhn just said really disturbed me. It seemed to me that he was suggesting that one should really only care about what most physicists are concerned about today. Now, I really find this very puzzling. What significance for the philosophy of science? For the physics is another story, I'm saying. But what significance for the philosophy of science is it that today, or in the last 30 years, most physicists have been concerned with the particular sorts of problems in that certain problems have been dropped as irrelevant, namely the problem of the interpretation of quantum theory. And then Bob said this, which I think it was a strong criticism for a philosopher. I think this is really a peculiar sort of way to look at the history of physics or the way physics is carried out. And then to take what most physicists are doing as some sort of standard on which to base a methodology in the prescriptive sense. But in more recent times, we had and we still have a number of studies dedicated to scientific controversies. I have revised this literature, and for different reasons. More recently, I am very interested in understanding quantum scientific controversies, and I would not say that I was surprised, but some of these philosophers, I would say that they just follow in a manner or order what Kuhn said about the quantum controversy. For instance, Peter Maschmeyer, in a volume published in 2000, he and his colleagues suggested that Einstein, who had challenged the logical and philosophical feasibility of the orthodox interpretation of quantum mechanics, eventually, I'm quoting, implicitly recognized that in terms of argument, he was defeated. And he cites a letter from Einstein to Max Born in 1947, which says, Einstein said, quoting, I cannot, however, base this conviction, this criticism towards quantum mechanics, on logical reasons, but can only produce my little finger as witness. It's just an example, but it's a very illustrative example. Maschmeyer is not familiar with the fact that Einstein kept his position criticizing the usual interpretation till the end of his days. 1 year after this letter, it was organized and published this volume dedicated to Einstein, scientists, philosophers, and in this volume, Einstein reiterated his position and presented a kind of a program for the development of research, a program which is far away from the program of quantum mechanics, because it's a program based on continuous functions in the continuous space-time. But we cannot say about somebody who, till the end of his days, kept his position, who dedicated his last energy to this program, that he was somebody who considered himself defeated in this battle. Just to do just in a previous volume in 1987, still a volume about scientific controls, McMullen had a very different point of view. He said that he was telling about situations where a number of assumptions and commitments are at stake in scientific controls, and in these cases, it's not a question that may be solved just arguing that a candidate theory has more predictive power than the other candidate, or because there was not a viable alternative to the existing interpretation of theory. And the example he used was precisely Einstein, and later Bohm, Vigier, and the others, and he cited these people when he said that these physicists urged that, I'm quoting, urged that because of its departure, quantum mechanics, from the deterministic pattern of classical mechanics, it could at best be regarded only as a stopgap. It could not, in their view, be reconciled with a larger philosophical view of nature whose sources are wider than physics alone. We may discuss today if we can limit Einstein's stance and even Einstein's to the recovery of determinism. We can discuss and criticize this, but the important position here is that McMullen he is recognizing that the debates, the long, to use this French expression, the longue durée expression, the longue durée debates on quantum mechanics, they are a kind of a genuine scientific controversy.
And we have 5 minutes now.
Excellent. Less than 5. I would just cite a problem. It's a problem that I do not have a good solution, but I like to talk about the problem. The problem is that my topic at the beginning was the role of experiments. Now I want to say the elusive role of experiments. What is the problem? Is that despite the number of experimental achievements in foundation of quantum mechanics, so far we do not have experiments that may contrast, for instance, the usual interpretation of quantum physics against any major alternative interpretations of theories. We have different cases. If you take, for instance, experiments with Bell theory, they may make a contrast between local realism and quantum mechanics. And we can say that from these debates, from these experiments, physicists have accepted the idea that any physical theory cannot be local realist, then due to the victory of quantum mechanics in the predictions about these experiments. But if you think that there was no local hidden variables in the arena of the interpretation of quantum mechanics, and that the hidden variables which was available by David Bohm in 1952, this was a non-local hidden variables interpretation. We can say that this whole bunch of experiments, important as they were, they could not discard Bohm's interpretation of quantum mechanics. If I take any other major interpretation, we have the same problem. We do not have meaningful experiments against this interpretation. Some of them are being formulated in a manner that you cannot contrast this alternative interpretation with the standard alternative interpretation. So, what is the role for experiments in the future of this controversy? Then I conclude with this very, I think, a little bit provocative affirmative. In a futuristic and dystopian scenario, the controversy over the quantum could either fade away without resolution or enter a stage of peaceful coexistence of distinct interpretation. I know that some physicists, or many physicists, do not accept this possibility. I know that at the moment, for instance, Angelo Bassi and his team are trying to make a very important experiment to check GRW theory against standard quantum mechanics. I know that Basil Hiley is supporting an experiment in London trying to check Bohm's original suggestion with the quantum potential against, in particular, what we call Bohm mechanics. But if you think that so far there is no experiment settling this controversy, we can just think about this, what I call dystopian scenario, dystopian for the physics. And finally, I would say that this conjecture reminds us of the Johann Quine thesis on the undetermination of theories by the empirical data. As you know, this thesis lost a little bit his flavor among philosophers because it is considered a source for the relativism which plagued science studies in the last 30, 40 years. But as a matter of fact, I would say that the quantum mechanics may well illustrate the implications of Johann Quine thesis. I'm not the first to suggest this. The first to suggest this was James Cushing, the late philosopher of science, Jim Cushing. Thank you very much.
Great, Olival. Thank you very much. So we have time for discussions now. So Otávio is the first one. Please, Otávio.
Olival, thanks for the great talk. Really rich, a lot of details. So I have a question about Feyerabend's contribution to this debate, right? I'm familiar with the papers he wrote, especially in the sort of 50s and 60s, and defending the kind of realism that he was defending then. And I'm just not, it's not clear to me how influential these papers have actually been, right? So he, for example, I remember one of his, he has a sort of a critique of von Neumann's proof of the non-hidden variables interpretation and trying to poke some problems there, but I'm not sure that anything actually came out of those papers. Do you have a sense of the impact of that?
Thanks, Otávio. A small answer. But first, a kind of publicity. We have a chapter in the handbook by Thomas Rickman, which is dedicated exactly to the contribution of philosophers of science, including Feyerabend, to this debate. Now, what I can say, Feyerabend he played a positive role in the end of the 50s and the early 60s, when Popper was coming back to the debates on quantum mechanics. As you know, Popper was very interested in the early 30s, and he suggested an experiment which was criticized. Then he slowly come back. And at that time, Popper in London and Feyerabend participated in some discussions at that time. Then I can say that there is a hidden story at that moment, a story of conflict between Feyerabend and Popper. You may see some of these in a paper by Flavio del Santo, an Italian physicist who is now in Vienna. He wrote and published in studying the history and philosophy of modern physics. This paper I can send to you the precise reference. Then there was a tension, but in general terms, I would say that as Feyerabend criticized the Copenhagen interpretation and the idea that the Copenhagen interpretation was the final word for quantum mechanics, his stance was supporting either a physicist like Popper, who was moving back, interested in the foundation of quantum mechanics, or he was also supportive of David Bohm. He had important discussions with David Bohm when David Bohm was in Bristol. He was at the philosophy department and Bohm in the physics department from 1957 to 1960. Then I think that it is not an influence in the sense that his papers left a mark. This paper where he was criticizing von Neumann, this was exactly the paper that Popper did not like. So the influence, from my point of view, it was you had here an influential philosopher, a young and influential philosopher, who was dialoguing with other philosophers and physicists who were interested in the debates of quantum mechanics in a time that there was not a wider acceptance of the importance of these debates. So it was more a professional and social and even intellectual influence than a result that we can say this was the contribution from Freire.
Yeah, no, that's very, very, very helpful. And so, yeah, if you could send me the reference, I would love to read. And does in the handbook, does the contribution that you mentioned also discusses some of Feyerabend's?
Yes, I may send the chapter to you.
Perfect.
Nowadays, it's everything in the publisher's hands. We may circulate the
Wonderful.
papers.
Thank you so much, Olival.
Thank you, Otávio. Now, Christian has a question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Olival, for this great talk. It was very interesting. I'm a huge fan of your work, so it's really nice to meet you at last, even though in this context. And I wanted to ask you about. Well, I tend to see the dispute between Einstein and Bohr, if we put it between two main figures, as a dispute also related to the meaning of physics. What is physics actually? And I think that you in your book you point out on several aspects of this point. I would like your reflections about this, if you find it meaningful, this kind of reading of the history of physics as a change of physics itself during the 20th century.
Christian, I think that your question is very, very inspiring, because you see, in my book, The Quantum Dissidents, I claim that these physicists who were aligned with Einstein's view about the meaning of physics, even if they were not aligned with Einstein's proposal of interpretation of quantum mechanics. So physicists like Bell, Bohm, Everett, Agnes Shimon, and so on, they were responsible for, I would say, a huge contribution of physicists, a huge contribution for physics, because this insistence on the realistic view, may understand the realistic as you want, but this broad insistence that quantum mechanics was telling us something, even if some of these physicists did not accept what quantum mechanics was telling. As you know, John Bell, ultimately, he never accepted this idea that the quantum entanglement could be a final solution for the interpretation of quantum mechanics. The same for Clauser. Clauser, who did the first experiment confirming quantum mechanics predictions, he was a very Bohmian in the sense that there is an interview was done by John Bromberg. It is at the American Institute of Physics, and he said he could not understand physics if he could not see one thing is here, the other thing is over there, and they interact. So for him, since he was an undergraduate student, he could not understand quantum mechanics. This is a very interesting interview, because it's a great physicist saying that he cannot understand quantum mechanics. So this insistence in this realism pushed this physics forward. Now, if you asked me about the future, I am more modest. I like any realistic view about the quantum mechanics, But I think that in the last 25 years, there is, I would say, a number of physicists who are just Bohrians, and they are supporting the research on quantum mechanics. If you take Anton Zagni is a Bohrian, no doubt about this. But I think it's a person who is pushing our understanding of quantum mechanics towards. And the people who are trying to refund quantum mechanics, either by through a logical approach, as many of you here, or by an algebraic approach or mathematical approach, or still an approach based on the concept of information, we cannot say that these people are realistic. But they are contributing to tack this unknown world of foundations of quantum mechanics. Then I think that Einstein's views about the meaning of physics played an important role in the middle of the 20th century. Nowadays and in the future, I do not say. It's a matter to see in the near future.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, Olival, just a quick question. There is much talk about Bohmian quantum mechanics, Everettian quantum mechanics, and collapse-based quantum theories. And there is a distinction that sometimes comes up, which is the distinction between, are these quantum theories or interpretations of quantum mechanics? Do you think that this distinction is just an idle bookkeeping matters, or do you think that this distinction plays an important role on the foundations of quantum mechanics?
Excellent question, Raoni. I did not elaborate myself very much about this subject, but in the organization of this handbook, I was attentive to this subject because we said explicitly in the introduction that some proposals are not exactly interpretations of quantum mechanics as they just change the theory. I would say that the case which is more clear crystal case is the GRW approach. In the case of Bohmian mechanics, it is one may discuss. And the Everettian approach, many physicists would say that it is elaborated just to mirror quantum mechanics. So my answer is that some of these alternative interpretation, they are indeed different theories. And we said explicitly in the introduction that we use Oxford Handbook of the History of Interpretation, just to be brief, because for a title of a handbook, it would be too much, the history of interpretation and the foundations of quantum mechanics.